Hey everybody, welcome to today's episode. Now, you might have noticed the name has changed to China Insider with David Zhang. The reason is I used to have a YouTube channel called China Insider, and that was a part of the Epoch Times YouTube channel. Since then, they've decided to change the name of their channel, so we got the chance and the opportunity to switch that name to ourselves. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to our channel and like the video to help us grow. Now, we're at a pivotal moment in history. The Chinese Communist Party this week formally declared a war on us, and they claim that if the US cannot change course on the bilateral relationship, there will be conflict. Much like Japan in World War II or Germany before World War I, we're seeing the aggressor trying to justify their upcoming war. Of course, for the CCP, that's an invasion on Taiwan. This came as a threat directly from the mouth of Chairman Xi Jinping, now holding three titles: General Secretary, Chairman of the Military Commission, and President of the People's Republic of China. But it's rare to see a threat directly from Xi himself, because it's usually the job of the Chinese Foreign Ministry to give such aggressive comments. It's very typical for the CCP to portray themselves as victims, such as the nature of socialism and communism, and it teaches people to play victims. By doing so, they twist and flip reality. This is, again, an attempt to play the narrative game. I'm going to dispel that here. The CCP's political warfare and ideological export are simply the most important factor in defeating the United States. In many developed nations, history has been undermined and deconstructed, causing us to lose confidence in ourselves and the fabric of our society to become frayed and fragmented. We blame white people for slavery, blaming men for women's rights, and blaming society for the inequality factor. Now, these are all debatable topics that we can do some other day, but they're being used and overstretched by the CCP to advance their ideas, because it helps them win the ideological and narrative war. Now, the US is undermining its own ability to defend freedom if we are caught in these history-altering motives. We understand that it's simply impossible, of course, to reject these views right away or to reform society in a matter of a few years, but what this has done is amplifying the CCP's talking points about how the West, mainly the United States, has been the aggressor and the oppressor. Now, blaming the US doesn't work out too well recently, in especially these years. It has been only done an alienating factor of the CCP. And internationally, they've been further isolated. But what can you do? Old habits die hard. And just a few weeks ago, they were still fooling the media, trying to pretend to be likable and nice. This indicates one important thing. The CCP is setting the tone for its future, ripping off the mask of the hints of diplomacy they held onto. And now there's basically no reason for anyone in the United States to still claim that the CCP is a friend. But don't let the threat scare you. It's not the first time the CCP has done so. Declaring war against the West, in fact, the fundamental mission of the CCP is to destroy the United States, as the two are ideologically incompatible. As Biles Yu puts it, a China expert, the CCP's war threat against the US has never stopped. From Mao's imperialism and all reactionaries are paper tigers, the east wind prevailing over the west wind, to Deng's hide and bite, to Zhang's using confrontation to promote cooperation, the poise is always there. On Tuesday, Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang also reiterated this tone of blaming the US. He's simply following the tone set by Xi Jinping. These are two conclusions that we can draw here. The first is that the CCP and the US are at a crossroad of competing to protect Taiwan, or the invasion if you're China. And the second is that all this is not the doing of the United States, but the Chinese Communist Party itself. The CCP claims that the US is trying to enact containment, which is a Cold War strategy against China. Now, the idea is to isolate and alienate the CCP like we had done for the Soviet Union against global allies. Now, in reality, this is not the case. I found an interesting piece in the Financial Times today. Now, it's an opinion column written by one of its national editor, Edward Luce. He argues that even if China were not a one-party dictatorship, the US would still be pressuring China. Now, I agree in the extent that if the CCP were a Communist Party system without Taiwan, they would certainly make move on Japan or another country instead. Therefore, the US would still engage with the CCP one way or another. And Taiwan to the CCP is simply a piece or a step towards the actual goal, or the CCP's ambition, which is to destroy the United States. With or without Taiwan, the goal stays the same. And let's not forget that the end game of the CCP is to win a 100-year marathon against the United States. And as we said in the beginning this week, Xi Jinping went further than before in naming America as the force behind the so-called containment or encirclement and suppression of China. Now, I found in Luce's piece what I think misguides many people is the fact that Edward Luce claimed, quote, Washington groupthink drove Biden's overreaction. The consensus is now so hawkish that it is liable to see any outreach to China as weakness. Now, he then argues that bipartisanship isn't always a good thing, citing Vietnam War, Iraq War, and the new House Committee on China. Now, I say that there is no dangerous group thinking in Washington on China. Now, it is in fact just laying out the facts about what the CCP has basically done in the United States to threaten our national security and those in other free and democratic nations. It is in fact all the CCP's own doing to result in the state that we're seeing today. Now, we can't use history with the Soviet Union to examine our strategy on China today. Now, there's fundamental differences to see here. Today's CCP is much more cunning than the Soviets. We're learning the mistakes and we're paying for it for Nixon reaching out to China back in the Cold War era. And it's here that I think Edward Luce starts to repeat a CCP talking point. Quote, a big difference between today's Cold War and the original one is that China is not exporting revolution. From Cuba to Angola to Korea to Ethiopia, the Soviet Union underwrote left-wing insurgencies worldwide. Now, you got to remember, North Korea, the CCP largely contributed millions of so-called volunteer soldiers to fight the war. They were more active in the war to defend North Korea against the South and the United States than the Soviet Union ever was. Sure, the CCP isn't fueling new rise of communism around the world today. It is, however, fueling Russia's war in Ukraine, North Korea's threat of nuclear weapons, Iran's nuclear weapons, and the dictatorships around the world, precisely using the technology, money, and surveillance export to those authoritarian nations. Now, these are ideologically aligning regimes for the CCP. And today's communist export from the CCP is actually, I argue, much worse than that of the Soviet Union. They no longer require the umbrella of communism to spread itself, right? They can do so through totalitarianism, authoritarianism, or even false democracy. So let's talk about containment. Is the US wrong to contain the spread of today's communism? Well, I think we would agree that this new form is much more dangerous. It's more hidden when it is fueled by intellectual property theft, military advancement, and technological totalitarianism. We lose much more today than we did in the Cold War. Back in the days, we just have to fight them militarily, compete, race to space, and define our ideological differences. Our information today, our data, intelligence, technology, way of life, history, military, all of that is under attack from the CCP. Containment, as laid out by George Kennan's 1947 Foreign Affairs essay to stop the expansion of the Soviet Empire and to shore up Western democracy, we understand that as to encircle something. What we're trying to do today is not doing that. What we are trying to contain is the effects of the CCP attacking other nations, in particular the United States, Japan, Taiwan, and Western democracy. What we're trying to do is contain the effects that threaten American national security, and that's it. When Xi talks of suppression, he means America's ban on advanced semiconductor exports to China. Now, since high-end chips are being used in both civil and military applications, the US has grounds for denying China that technology, right? It means that it's trying to upgrade its military for invading Taiwan or threatening nearby countries. This isn't happening because China is abiding by the rules of the game, where they're fairly trading with the rest of the world. It is on the ground that the CCP steals technology and then uses those to enact unfair trade practices, all the while preparing to export those technology in a negative way to the other nations who align with them ideologically, like Iran, North Korea, and bringing more dictators under the influence of the CCP. Now, Luce argues that the collateral effect of limiting China's economic development. We all know what a booming CCP would do for the world. They will cut out our strategic supply chain, deny nations who don't agree with their politics, in other words, start economic warfare against these countries like Australia, Taiwan, or Lithuania to pressure them to succumb to the CCP. Now, they fuel the rise of their military to take over Taiwan or threaten other nations' sovereignty. And I generally agree, though, with some of the points that Edward Luce makes. For example, he says when Xi refers to encirclement, he's thinking about America's deepening ties to China's neighbors. Now, again, he says here, Xi mostly has himself to blame. Japan's shift to a more normal military stance, which includes a doubling of its defense spending, probably worries China the most. But America's growing closenesses to the Philippines and India and AUKUS with Australia and the UK are all part of the picture. And then add in the increased US arms transfers to Taiwan, and the ingredients for Chinese paranoia are ripe. Now, I do think that China is worried that the US is making moves around China. But these, again, are not because the US is the one that's actively trying to invade a country. What I disagree is where Luce's argument for a long-term, less Cold War-like dealing with China comes from. It doesn't come from a point of the US protecting its national security and freedom around the world, but a point of keeping China in the game for the sake of it. Now remember, folks, we're not against China or the people of China. We're at war with the Chinese Communist Party. Right? Confusing these two concepts will already start you off on the wrong ground. And the US is not here to contain China. It's here to contain the spread of Chinese communism, which has developed a sophisticated system through either the Belt and Road Initiative or supporting Russia or North Korea or Iran. Let's make this make sense. The CCP war threats may not scare us, but it does reflect a reality. Following the 2 sessions this week, which is an annual study conference for the party, they have enacted measures to ensure by the end of the decade that the CCP can invade Taiwan. Now, whether they will or how successful still depends on many factors, namely their domestic economy, but what we're seeing now is that we're seeing wartime preparations to invade Taiwan. And the problem is wish and do are 2 different concepts. Xi could be preparing for it all, but if China's economy doesn't bounce back, how could they fund the invasion? First, Xi announced that there will be tighter controls on the economic policies, promising to oversee much of the economic recovery from zero COVID, and the CCP claims that they will boost their GDP by 5% this year. Well, how? It largely will depend on state intervention and tighter control across the financial sector, but it's not looking too hot. Simply because, well, the attraction of the Chinese market is loosening, and the idea that foreign investors will stay in 2023 is still an unknown factor. And they're also to boost military spending to about $225 billion, which is about 7.2% of the GDP. They're readying for an invasion on Taiwan, which means that this country, if it gets money again, the Chinese Communist Party, they will only be enacting a tone of aggression and fuel more military powers that then will be transferred to use to undermine the United States. So is this the country that is being unjustly contained? Is this the country that seeks peace? Well, absolutely not. The US is not overstepping to annex a Chinese province or to wrongfully stopping China from trading with other people. They're simply trying to enact a worldview that the CCP doesn't fit in. And that's the core of it. There's no modern day colonialism or imperialism or victimhood that the US is the aggressor. All of this is because the Chinese Communist Party is the one trying to invade Taiwan, trying to commit unfair trade practices, trying to steal technology. So there's no containment if the CCP collapses, and the containment is actually only aimed at the CCP. All right, that's it for today's China Insider episode. I'm David Zhang. If you enjoy the content, make sure to like and subscribe our channel, as well as also comment below what your thoughts are on today's topic. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.